August 1943. Sicily. Inside a U.S. Army field hospital, far from the sound of gunfire, senior officers stood among rows of wounded men, the air heavy with antiseptic and exhaustion. At the center of the group was Lieutenant General George S. Patton, commander of the U.S. 7th Army. He was not inspecting terrain. He was not reviewing plans. He was walking hospital wards. The decision occurred without warning and without deliberation. A young American private stood before Patton. He had no visible wounds. His body shook uncontrollably. He told the doctors he could not return to the front. He said the artillery noise had broken him. Patton stepped forward. He did not consult the medical officers. He did not ask for a report. He decided immediately that the man was lying. He struck the soldier across the face with his open hand, loud enough for the ward to hear. He shouted that the man was a coward. He ordered him out of the hospital and back to the front line. The doctors froze. No one intervened. The decision did not end there. Days later, at a second field hospital, Patton encountered another soldier suffering from the same condition. Again, no physical wounds. Again, shaking, disoriented, unable to fight. Patton repeated the act. Another slap. Another public humiliation. This time, he threatened the man with his pistol. These were not accidents. They were not lapses of temper. They were deliberate acts of command authority. Patton believed fear was a moral failure. He believed compassion in war-weakened armies. In that moment, he chose to enforce his doctrine with his hand. The decision was made in full view of the medical staff. It violated Army regulations. It crossed a line that could not be erased. The battlefield would not judge this decision. The consequences would come later, carried upward through reports, whispered conversations, and finally into the highest levels of Allied command. In August 1943, the opportunity was not tactical. It was institutional. The U.S. Army stood at a crossroads in how it understood combat endurance, fear, and psychological collapse. By that point in the war, American forces had been fighting continuously across North Africa and into Sicily. Units were exhausted. Replacement systems were strained. Casualties were not only physical. Soldiers were breaking down under sustained artillery fire, sleep deprivation, and constant threat of death. Medical officers on the ground were already seeing a pattern. Men without wounds who could no longer function. Shaking hands. Blank stares. Inability to obey orders. The British had encountered it earlier and called it battle exhaustion. The Americans used the term battle fatigue, but it existed in a gray zone. It was not yet fully accepted as an injury. The military opportunity, at that moment, was to adapt, to formalize psychological casualties as legitimate, to allow medical authority to supersede command instinct, to recognize that removing broken soldiers from the line preserved fighting strength over time. The data already existed. British medical units had shown that rest and treatment could return many men to combat effectiveness. The alternative was cycling broken soldiers back into units where they endangered themselves and others. Commanders in Sicily had the authority to set precedent. Senior generals could model restraint. They could reinforce medical protocols. They could signal that fear was not automatically dishonor. This was not softness. It was force preservation. George Patton, more than most, was positioned to shape that doctrine. He commanded a victorious army. His reputation carried weight. His words traveled quickly through ranks. If Patton had accepted the medical assessment, it would have sent a clear message. Psychological injury was real, and discipline did not require cruelty. Instead, the opportunity narrowed. Patton viewed the situation through a pre-war lens. His military education came from an era that treated morale as character and collapse as weakness. In his mind, acknowledging battle fatigue risked contagion. If fear were legitimized, it might spread. He believed armies survived by suppressing it, not accommodating it. From a purely military logic, this belief was not irrational by the standards of his generation. Armies had collapsed before when fear went unchecked. Patton's concern was cohesion, not compassion. But the opportunity lay in recalibrating that logic for industrial war, where artillery, air power, and continuous operations shattered men in ways no drill could prevent. The U.S. Army had not yet decided which interpretation would dominate. That decision was still fluid in Sicily. Doctrine was unwritten. The system had room to bend. Patton's actions closed that space. By asserting command authority over medical judgment, he forced the institution to respond. Either his behavior would be sanctioned, or the Army would implicitly endorse his definition of courage. The opportunity was not to spare two soldiers. It was to determine whether modern warfare required a modern understanding of human limits. That decision was still available in August 1943. It would not remain so for long. Patton did not act without preparation. He had already formed his assessment long before he entered the hospital wards. By 1943, Patton had spent decades constructing a rigid theory of combat effectiveness. It was built on speed, aggression, and unrelenting pressure. In his view, hesitation killed armies. Fear, if tolerated, multiplied. He believed morale was not a medical condition but a command responsibility, enforced through discipline and example. His credibility within the system was real. In North Africa, he had taken over a shattered U.S. Corps after Kasserine. Within weeks, he restored order. Units that had collapsed were reorganized. Standards were enforced. Officers were removed. Equipment was standardized. Patrols resumed. The transformation was rapid and visible. German intelligence noticed. American command noticed. The lesson Patton drew was simple: harsh discipline worked. Sicily reinforced that belief. His 7th Army moved faster than expected, covering ground aggressively, often outpacing Allied formations. He rewarded initiative and punished failure publicly. His command climate was deliberately unforgiving. Soldiers understood what was expected. Fear was to be mastered or hidden. There was no institutional space for collapse. Patton's preparation was ideological, not situational. He had read extensively on ancient and modern warfare. He believed history punished commanders who tolerated weakness. He saw psychological breakdown not as injury, but as abdication. In his private writings, he consistently framed war as a test of will rather than endurance. Men who broke, in his estimation, endangered everyone else. Medical science did not alter that framework. Army psychiatry was still in its infancy. There was no diagnostic clarity, no consensus doctrine. Doctors could remove soldiers from the line, but their authority rested on fragile ground. Patton did not see them as arbiters of combat readiness. He saw them as technicians whose judgments had to serve operational necessity. Before the slapping incidents, Patton had already issued guidance to his officers. Soldiers who claimed exhaustion without wounds were suspect. He warned against what he considered malingering. He believed leniency invited imitation. His staff knew this position. It was consistent, predictable. From Patton's perspective, the hospital encounters confirmed his fears. The men he saw did not look injured. They looked frightened. In his mental model, that distinction mattered more than any medical explanation. Allowing such men to remain hospitalized would signal to the rest of the army that fear provided escape. His assessment was not impulsive. It was the execution of a long-held doctrine under stress. He believed the greater danger lay not in punishing the few, but in undermining the many. What Patton did not prepare for was the institutional reaction. He assumed his record would shield him. He assumed results would outweigh method. He assumed the army shared his definition of necessity. Those assumptions would soon be tested. The overrule did not come from a single voice. It emerged from a system designed to contain exactly this kind of damage. The first reports moved quietly. Medical officers filed formal complaints through their channels. They did not accuse Patton of cruelty. They documented behavior: physical assault, verbal abuse, interference with medical authority. These reports climbed the chain with caution. Patton was not an ordinary commander. He was winning. He was visible. He was valuable. At each level, officers hesitated. No one wanted to be responsible for triggering a confrontation with the most aggressive American general in theater. But the paper trail continued upward, carried by regulation rather than outrage. Eventually, the reports reached Allied headquarters. Dwight D. Eisenhower did not receive them in a vacuum. He already understood Patton's volatility. He had managed him since North Africa. He knew Patton's strengths and his liabilities. speed, initiative, audacity. Also ego, impatience, and contempt for constraint. Eisenhower's task was not to judge character. It was to preserve the coalition. The problem was not what Patton believed. Many senior officers shared similar views about discipline. The problem was visibility. These incidents occurred in hospitals, in front of witnesses, against defenseless soldiers. If the story escaped, it would not remain a military matter. It would become a political one. Eisenhower faced overlapping pressures. The American public was sensitive to the treatment of its soldiers. Congress was already alert to any hint of abuse. The Army's medical corps had institutional standing that could not be ignored. At the same time, the Allied command structure was fragile. Removing Patton outright risked disrupting ongoing operations and emboldening critics within the alliance. There was also timing. Sicily had just concluded. The invasion of Italy was next. The buildup for France was already underway. Eisenhower could not afford a public scandal involving one of his most prominent commanders. He needed Patton's reputation managed, not detonated. The response was therefore calibrated, not punitive. Eisenhower summoned Patton and confronted him directly. There was no ambiguity. The behavior was unacceptable. It violated regulations. It endangered the Army's credibility. Eisenhower did not debate Patton's philosophy. He drew a boundary. Patton was not court-martialed. No charges were filed. That was a decision rooted in institutional self-preservation. A trial would expose everything. It would force testimony. It would invite press scrutiny. It would fracture confidence at home and among allies. Instead, Eisenhower imposed control. Patton was ordered to apologize personally to the soldiers involved. He was required to address medical staff and acknowledge their authority. Most significantly, he was removed from active combat command. Not publicly fired. Quietly sidelined. This was not leniency. It was containment. Patton remained in uniform, but his momentum was broken. His army was reassigned. His role became ambiguous. He retained rank without influence. The overrule was shaped by politics, medicine, alliance management, and public perception. Military logic alone did not dictate the outcome. Eisenhower's decision balanced competing risks. The risk of keeping Patton unchecked versus the risk of losing him entirely. The system chose restraint, not because it excused Patton's actions, but because it feared the consequences of addressing them openly. Patton had enforced his doctrine with his hand. Eisenhower now enforced limits with silence, delay, and reassignment. The war continued. The damage was deferred. The consequences unfolded slowly, but they were decisive. Patton did not return to combat command after Sicily. His 7th Army moved on without him. Other generals planned the next operations. His name disappeared from operational briefings. He remained present, visible in uniform, but functionally inert. This was not an accident. It was deliberate insulation. The immediate effect was operational absence. When Allied forces landed on the Italian mainland, Patton was not there to exploit momentum. When planning accelerated for the invasion of France, his voice was excluded. The most aggressive American field commander was sidelined during the most critical planning phase of the war in Europe. Officially, nothing had happened. There were no public statements explaining his reassignment. Internally, everyone understood. Patton had crossed a line that could not be acknowledged openly, but could not be ignored either. Within the Army, the message was mixed. Discipline remained paramount, but so did appearances. Commanders were reminded, quietly, that authority had limits. Medical officers gained leverage. Their reports now carried weight beyond hospital walls. The institution did not reverse its culture overnight, but the Sicily incident became a reference point, spoken of carefully, usually behind closed doors. For Patton, the consequences were personal and structural. He complied with Eisenhower's orders. He apologized to the soldiers. He addressed medical staff. Those acts did not come naturally. They were not gestures of reflection. They were conditions of survival. His reputation fractured. Among some officers, he remained indispensable. The general who moved faster than anyone else, who understood maneuver warfare intuitively. Among others, he became dangerous, unpredictable, a liability if left unchecked. Both views could coexist only if Patton was controlled. Publicly, the damage was worse. When the story eventually reached the press months later, it landed without context. The details were blunt. A general had slapped wounded soldiers. Editorials followed. Lawmakers expressed outrage. The Army's silence only sharpened the criticism. The narrative hardened quickly. Eisenhower absorbed the pressure. He did not defend Patton's actions. He emphasized discipline and regret. He allowed the public to see restraint without explanation. It was enough to defuse immediate calls for dismissal, but not enough to restore Patton's standing. For a time, Patton became a symbol of excess, a reminder that brilliance did not excuse brutality. The same traits that had terrified German commanders now unsettled American civilians. His effectiveness had become politically conditional. The operational cost was measurable. During the Normandy landings, Patton was absent from the battlefield. He commanded no army. He did not shape the initial breakout. Others filled that role, more methodical, less explosive. The war did not stall, but it did not surge either. Ironically, Patton's sidelining became useful. German intelligence fixated on his reputation. Allied planners exploited it. They allowed the enemy to believe he commanded a phantom army, poised to strike where it never would. His enforced inactivity became deception by default. Eventually, the system judged the risk acceptable again. Patton was given command of the Third Army after the Normandy breakout. By then, the parameters were clear. He would be unleashed, but not trusted. Watched. Managed. Ready to be reined in. On the battlefield, the consequences reversed. Patton moved as expected. Fast. Ruthless. Relentless. He restored momentum where it had lagged. He justified, in purely military terms, the decision not to discard him. But the institutional scar remained. Patton never fully escaped Sicily. His superiors never forgot that his instincts required containment. His subordinates never forgot what he demanded. His enemies never forgot how dangerous he was when unleashed. The soldiers he struck did not shape strategy. They did not influence campaigns. Their suffering did not alter the course of the war directly. But the decision to strike them altered how the army managed one of its most effective commanders. The consequence was not justice or absolution. It was control. Patton paid for his decision not with rank, but with trust. The system kept him because it needed him. It restrained him because it feared him. That balance defined the rest of his war. The post-war record closed the case without softening it. After the war, the U.S. Army did not dispute what happened in Sicily. The facts were never seriously challenged. Patton had struck hospitalized soldiers. He had interfered with medical authority. He had violated regulations. The ambiguity lay not in the actions, but in how the institution chose to frame them. Official correspondence released later showed Eisenhower's position clearly. He condemned the behavior without hesitation. In private letters, he described it as indefensible. But those same documents also revealed his reasoning for restraint. Patton was too valuable to discard in the middle of a global war. The decision had been one of management, not forgiveness. Patton's own post-war writings were revealing by omission. In his memoirs, he acknowledged the incidents briefly, without detail, without remorse, and without reflection. He framed them as misunderstandings amplified by circumstance. He did not revisit the soldiers. He did not reconsider his beliefs about fear. His silence functioned as a defense. The Army's institutional memory evolved differently. By 1944 and 1945, combat exhaustion was being treated more systematically. Forward psychiatric units were established. Rotation policies were refined. Rest and recovery were recognized as force multipliers. By the time the war ended, battle fatigue was no longer dismissed as cowardice. After the war, it would be renamed, studied, and eventually formalized as post-traumatic stress disorder. This evolution did not rehabilitate Patton's decision. It contextualized it. His actions were increasingly seen as products of an outdated doctrine colliding with industrial warfare. The Army adapted. Patton did not. Eisenhower's reputation benefited from hindsight. Historians credited him with preserving operational effectiveness while preventing institutional fracture. He neither destroyed Patton nor excused him. He absorbed the political cost, enforced boundaries, and delayed judgment until victory made silence possible. Congressional inquiries faded. The public moved on. The soldiers involved disappeared into the mass of wartime casualties, their names rarely recorded outside medical files. There was no formal reckoning for them. No public apology from the institution. The record noted the incident, then closed. Patton returned to prominence in popular culture as a symbol of aggressive command. Films emphasized speed, profanity, and battlefield success. The hospital wards in Sicily were rarely shown. When they were, they appeared as footnotes, not fulcrums. Within professional military education, the incident became a case study, not of morality, but of command limits. It illustrated how individual brilliance could threaten institutional legitimacy. It demonstrated that results did not grant immunity. It reinforced the principle that coalition warfare required political sensitivity as much as tactical skill. Patton died in 1945, months after the war ended. His career closed without further scandal. The Sicily incident remained unresolved, not because it was unclear, but because the institution had already rendered its verdict through action rather than trial. The post-war record does not absolve Patton. It does not condemn him theatrically. It documents a system choosing utility over purity, control over confrontation. The Army learned. Patton did not change. Eisenhower adjusted the structure around him. That adjustment, not the slap itself, defined the lasting outcome. The final verdict is not complicated. George S. Patton made a decision rooted in conviction, not impulse. He believed fear was weakness. He believed discipline required punishment. In Sicily, he enforced that belief with violence against his own soldiers. The facts are settled. The Army did not misunderstand him. It understood him clearly and chose containment over confrontation. Patton was not removed because the system needed his effectiveness. He was restrained because the system could not tolerate his methods in public. Dwight Eisenhower did not protect Patton out of loyalty. He protected the war effort. He imposed limits without spectacle. He preserved coalition stability. He accepted political risk quietly rather than institutional rupture loudly. The soldiers Patton struck were not symbols to him. They were threats to cohesion. To the Army, they were liabilities in a different way. Their suffering exposed a doctrinal fault line that could not be ignored once revealed. Patton returned to command because he delivered results. He was unleashed where speed mattered and washed where judgment failed. He won battles. He never adjusted his beliefs. The institution moved on without him. Psychological injury became recognized. Treatment replaced punishment. Doctrine evolved because industrial war demanded it. Patton remained frozen in an earlier understanding of courage. That rigidity made him lethal to enemies and dangerous to his own side. The case closes here. The slap did not end his career. It defined its limits. Victory required Patton. Control required Eisenhower. The Army chose both, at the cost of clarity and at the expense of the men in the hospital wards. History records the outcome, not the apology. If this examination added value to your understanding of how power, ego, and institutional fear shape war, subscribe for more closed-case analyses. Leave a comment if you choose. The verdict itself does not change.